This is a photograph of Albert Michael Burns, who was my grandfather, and who came from Ireland and landed in Fayetteville in 1966. 1866, excuse me. He was born in a suburb of Dublin, Ireland, Blackrock, which is a charming little town on the ocean there. And was in 1849, August the 2nd, 1849. So he was only about 17 years old when he finally landed in Fayetteville. He was learned the building trade, and then he had planing operated. They didn't have a planing plant there, and he put that in, and then he built up a big lumber yard business and did contracting and building, and was also a great civic leader in the town, because Fayetteville was just beginning to develop at that point. It was founded in 1828. He was instrumental in, he was the first president of the Chamber of Commerce. He was instrumental in establishing the power company there and in building the waterworks and all these civic improvements that they hadn't had before, the paving and so forth. But in his building, they said, estimated that he built over 400 buildings in Fayetteville alone, including one of the towers of the university, several buildings on the campus, and then many churches and homes and so forth. There is a section of Fayetteville in which my grandparents lived, their home was, which is now a historical district, in which he designed and built most of the homes there, and which are being preserved. It's a historical, we have a walking tour through that area. We have many pictures of the homes and a whole pamphlet on those. He was married to my grandmother, Mary McCoy, who was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 18 and they were married when she was about 16, 17 years old. I have all those notes there, I should have gotten that. And when all this Catholic Irish group had come over from Ireland, and I think their stopping point was there at in Providence, Rhode Island, and that's where she was born right after they came over, and they migrated on to this Irish settlement outside of Fayetteville. And her parents were so concerned over her education, though she was one of several children. I don't know whether the others had the same opportunity she had or not, but her father drove her down the mountains to Fort Smith so that she could attend the, wagon and horses, so she could attend St. Anne's Academy down there and receive an education. My grandfather saw her and fell in love with her, and so they were married, and they had 7 children as a result. Now one of the things, he has many write-ups at the Historical Society and Mrs. Fulbright's columns and he was one of the most prominent citizens at that time of Fayetteville, because he had built so much of Fayetteville and was so instrumental and so forth. And this is what one of the biographies in the encyclopedia said about him. He said, while a devout Catholic, his political affiliations were with the Republican Party. Though denied the advantage of a good education in his youth, Mr. Burns was an inveterate reader and was well posted on an unusually wide range of subjects. He was a man of fine character and forceful personality, and exerted an inestimable influence for civic and social betterment at the early development of his community, He was so, for instance, he was written up several times because when the United Daughters of the Confederacy were establishing the Confederate cemetery up on the mountain, which is right across from the Walker Cemetery where my aunt is buried. They had ordered this tall monument to go in the center of the cemetery. And my grandfather happened to be down at the depot, railroad depot, when it came in. And they didn't know what they were going to do with it. It was so big and so heavy and so cumbersome. And he said, oh, I'll get it up for you. And so he got his men and so forth and hauled it up to East Mountain and mounted it. So it's still standing here in the center of the cemetery. But he was a, I think there's a picture that I want to show of the Arkansas building. Now this,
Yeah, he has to.
Can you see the?
Well, we're gonna stop it first. We'll stop it.
Got just to pick the building.
Yeah. Okay, go.
What? Before you start filming it, what does it say there in the corner here? This is a picture. It's not full, but of the Arkansas building, which was commissioned, we are assuming, by the state of Arkansas as the state building at the Louisiana Purchase St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. It was the exhibition hall and the reception hall for all those who were interested in Arkansas when they came up to the St. Louis Exposition. So it was purchased by a real estate and businessman in Fayetteville, and who commissioned my grandfather, Albert Burns, to bring it back to Fayetteville and erect it on Mount Nord. It was located right down from where the Fulbright home was located. My grandfather had only been in the building twice, but he replicated it, brought it down. He numbered, had every piece numbered of this wooden construction, and brought it down piece by piece, numbered, and put it back exactly as it was in St. Louis. And this was quite a feat in those days to have been able to do that. It was in perfect condition. And it was offered as a big ballrooms. I remember taking dancing there in later years as for us, a hospital, and it was also used as for receptions and entertainments and so forth. And finally, during the Depression, there was just no money to maintain it. Just to paint that building would have been exorbitant. But it's very elaborate in the Greek period. And it finally had to be torn down, which is just a shame. Today, I hope they would have preserved it, but I don't know. I don't trust preservationists very much. But my grandfather, they said in here when they were writing about him, he said he, where did it say about the building? I can't see it. Right in here. That although he had been residing in the building only twice before it was dismantled, he reconstructed it in exact detail with the exception of some partition desired by the purchaser. But he was not only the foremost builder in the early Fayetteville in the material sense, but he was also a foremost civic leader. He was president of the first Fayetteville Chamber of Commerce in 1902, a member of the first board of the City Hospital, a member of the board of directors of the First Building and Loan Association. He also was one of the first in a bank that was organized before that. He also installed the first telephone system and erected the first electric light plant in Fayetteville. He then he did much government building. When he became ill, he was building for the government in all through Oklahoma for Indian schools and hospitals and dormitories, and in addition to residential building and so forth. So he was quite a leader. I'm sorry I don't have a full picture of this, of my grandmother. This is Mary McCoy Burns, who was he married my grandfather in 1870, and bore him 7 children, and lived to be 101 years old when she died in 1955. In 1954, when she celebrated her 100th birthday, which this picture was published in the newspaper, and this is an accompanying article about her. It was great detail. She was considered the First Lady of Fayetteville, I think, at that point in time. And she received the papal blessing and had a very special mass at St. Joseph's Church in Fayetteville. But she was one of those rare ladies who never raised her voice, but you knew that velvet glove contained a very strong hand, and she suffered many sorrows. She lost so many of her family, and but she had this serene faith and dedication to family and to friends. She was, when she was a little girl, her growing up, must have been quite young, her father took her in a wagon down the Boston Mountains, which must have been a very rough road, to Fort Smith, Arkansas. And they crossed the river on a boat to Fort Smith to attend St. Anne's Convent Academy there, because he was so anxious for her to have a Catholic education. But my grandfather met her, and on her return, apparently, because she was just around 16 or 17 years old when they were married, and they had a little cottage for 2 years on Spring Street in Fayetteville, and then he built the present home on Lafayette Avenue, East Lafayette Avenue. And that's where they lived until she died, or he died in 1937, and she died in 1954. Mrs. Fulbright who was Senator Fulbright's mother and was publisher of the Northwest Arkansas Times, and wrote a column very similar to what Celestine Sibley has now in the Atlanta Constitution. And one of this is one that was in, I don't even see the date on it, but she was writing about my grandmother, and she said this was a family that was there when she and Mr. J. Fulbright had moved to Fayetteville, and she said Mrs. A.M. Burns, she said, was born before the paper was, that was Northwest Arkansas Times. We point with pride to her and her progeny, Mrs. A.M. Burns, who will soon be 98 years of age, and a finer exponent of our community we do not know. She has resided in the same home for 72 years. Mrs. Burns has seemed to reap life's blessings in full. We bow in reverence and feel that she could teach us much, that had we the talents to learn. I'm sorry, it's hard for me to say it. Her church, Catholic, which is near her in her outstanding home and family, form centers of never-failing interest. Her husband was a most dynamic and interesting man who has been gone for many years. Mrs. Burns is a fine example of a great American lady. And then it goes on to tell about her family. And as I think I told you before, how active she was in the early days of the church in Fayetteville, but she was so revered, and as she grew older, so many of her children's friends, Miss Annie Futrell, Mrs. McElroy, and all these people, would come faithfully to see her, and I used to bring dates over there. They just loved her because she kept up with everything that was going on, and wanted to know all about what team was doing what, and she was an amazing lady, great person. Never complained and never, very stoic.
Okay. Got a nice thing.
What was the date on this till? This was 1906.
Wow.
It says in the bottom, doesn't it, 1906?
Christmas Day next
Sure,
year.
it was,
You're gonna need to point to the people to talk about.
well, I'll just say from left to right. Can you do that? This picture was taken on Christmas Day, 1907, in the side yard of my grandparents' home, Mr. and Mrs. A.M. Burns, on Lafayette Avenue, corner of Lafayette and Willow Avenue in Fayetteville. My mother said she looked so tired because she had been to a dance the night before, didn't get in very early. And my grandfather looks like he is worn out with all these family and all these children, but I'm sure he rose to the occasion. It starts out on the left in the back row, the tall back row, and that is J. Roy Dritt, who was the husband of Bess Burns Dritt, who was sitting right down in front of him. And she has a shawl around her shoulders. She was ill at the time. Her nurse is in this picture, and she died not long after, I mean, like a year or so. But she was only 25 when she died. Next, standing to Mr. Dritt is Mame Burns Walker, Aunt Mame, that we talk about all the time. And next to her was J. With Walker, her husband, who was a lawyer and a brother-in-law partner of Val Walker, which the library was named at the university, because he did so much to save the library. And next to him is Lee Redding Putman, and that was Aunt Nell's husband, Nell Putman's husband. And he was a lumberman also, and they had 5 children, all of whom graduated from Northwestern and lived in Evanston. And Bettie Putman Maxwell, my cousin who is still living, was their next oldest daughter. Next to him was my Aunt Dorothy Benbrook, and who was, I think at that point, was a widow already. Her husband had been killed. And next to her is the nurse who was taking care of my Aunt Bess. And then came my mother, and standing at the far right is the only son of the Burnses, who was their 7th child, and he was Bernard Michael Burns. He did have a son that was A.M. Burns, Albert Michael Burns, who was a lieutenant in the Navy during World War II. Seated is Aunt Bess, as I was saying, and then my grandmother, Mary McCoy Burns, and standing next was my Aunt Nell Burns Putman, who was expecting at that time and so was sort of shielded. And then came my grandfather, and then at the end of the line seated there was Father Bandini, and Father Bandini had brought a group of Italians, Italian colony over from Italy, and they established Tawnytown, which is a great grape growing area now, and which is about, that was outside of Springdale, about 9 miles north of Fayetteville. And he was a great friend of the family's. He married my mother and father. He buried my Aunt Bess. There was always Father Bandini all the time. But he was very revered and loved by the whole community up there because he did so much for this Italian colony that he had brought over. And seated on the ground was, as I say, it was Christmas morning, was various Indians and, and football players. One was Redding Putman, who was the son of Aunt Nell and Uncle Dick Putman. And then next to him is J. With Walker Jr., who was Aunt Mame and Uncle With. I have volumes of letters that With Walker was so good to write to my mother and aunt when they were living here with us, and their works of humorous art. I'm going to collect them. And then next to that was John Burns Walker, and who turned out to be quite an aviator. He flew his own plane and so forth. He was at one point vice president of Trans World Airlines, and then he established a consulting firm for airlines. He worked on Braniff and airplanes in the air companies in Europe. And they had a home in up east where my Aunt Mame went to live for many years. Not far from Newton, New Jersey, not far from where you all are now. And so that was Christmas. So that was the family at that point. Later, there were many grandchildren, and just like with us, too. This is a photograph of my mother and father and a friend. My mother and father, my father is to the left of my mother in this picture. She had gone downtown to in Fayetteville to meet my father. He had the Barnes Jewelry Store in Fayetteville to meet him for lunch or something. And this was a friend that was down there at the time, and they just decided to go in and have the picture taken. My father had was born in, as I think I've mentioned before, in Fruitport, Michigan, and had come down to Chicago to work and worked at Peacock's. I think that's where he got his training in jewelry and so forth. He was a fine engraver and artisan. And that's where he met my mother. He had one of the first cars in Fayetteville. And I remember with Junior, Walker was always so impressed with him because he thought he was so fine and so kind and so considerate of a young boy. But also he had this great car, which was quite an asset. But apparently he was a very fine, wonderful, romantic gentleman, and I'm just so sorry that I didn't know him. I still feel like he's looked after me all these years, however. But he developed diabetes, and it was just before insulin was discovered. And he went various places trying to seek medicinal help and so forth, and finally died at Natchez, Mississippi. Came into the church just before he died, and was buried from St. Joseph's in Fayetteville. He died on December the 1st, 1920. He was 38 years old. He was the same age as my husband's mother when she died. She was 38. So there was great loss in both families. But mother was quite a belle in her day, but then she proved to be a very caring, devoted mother, and supported herself and me, being left young with one child to support and no training in any field. So she was very highly thought of in this city because at the campus I have many, many letters about her, or to her. And a few years ago, I was asked to assemble as much as I could about her and about the early days of Cornell and the university, and so I did, and Till and Molly and I took all of these down. I still have more to send in. So there is in the university library, there is a compartment or an archive that has all the things that she did at the university, and also sort of a kaleidoscope of what life was on the university campus and in Fayetteville back in the turn of the century and up in the early 1900s. And there's a picture that we have of groups of her friends, and all in their lovely long dresses. And my father was his his mother was Elizabeth Dowling and married Barnes, Henry Barnes. So I was named for her. I was Elizabeth Dowling Barnes. And now Anne has carried on the name with Rebecca Dowling. And there are a lot of Elizabeths in the family, I'm happy to say. There's Sarah's and Elizabeth, and there's Elizabeth Leach. So the name has gone on. Picture of the George Unsworth family taken when they were, as you can see, very young. And
Which is Daddy's mother.
this was George Messner's grandparents and aunts and uncle. George Unsworth, the father, was born the oldest of, did I say 9? I think children, in Kirkby, Traileth, Traleth, Traileth, Lancaster County, England, on the 1st of April in 1858, and came to this country. And I am not sure exactly what time he came to the States, but he was a mining engineer, and he came over to take over the big one of those big shafts to. I don't know exactly what all he did, but he was schooled in engineering for mining. And he married Catherine Michael, is Meikele, and I don't know exactly what nationality that is. And in October of 1882, and in, I assume, in Calumet. And then he died in March of 1944. George's father died in January of, Alfred Messner, January of 44. And I had come up for the funeral, and for his funeral, and I went over to see Mr. Unsworth, and he was in the Calumet Hospital at that time, and we had a nice visit. I had my nice visit with him. I can still see him lying in the bed in his room. And so he lived a couple of months later. But he was a very tall, stately man with this beard and so forth. And when I first went up in September of 42 to meet the family and visit Calumet, George took me over to call on him, and he was very erect, and he said, "Barnes." I said, "That's English, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes, it was. My father was English. My father was a Barnes." But I said, "My mother was a Burns, and her father was from Ireland, father and mother." And he looked at me, looked down at me, and he said, "English, Irish, it will never mix." And so here we are, all these years later, we've mixed very well. So this is their family, and I think it's just a darling picture of them all. George's mother is standing next to her mother there on the left-hand side of the picture. And now Till will give you where the other ones are. And they had one son, as you can see, George Unsworth. And his widow, Aunt Mabel Unsworth, is still living at the age of 95 and as perky as she can be. And we see her, and I hear from her, and she calls me all the time. We're very close friends, and she loves all these children, our children. Right, Tim?
So the top left is Ethel Unsworth, who is Daddy's mother. Next to her is Catherine, the mother, Catherine Miskeel Unsworth. Next to her is Edith Mudge Unsworth.
No, she was, darling, Mudge and everything are their wedded names.
I mean, Edith Unsworth Mudge.
It's Mudge.
Sorry, right.
Her husband was a doctor in Marquette. And what was the first one?
Catherine. What are you talking about?
No.
Edith.
Edith. Yeah, she married